By 1932, the baseball world had made up its mind about Babe Ruth. He was finished. He was 37 years old, overweight, slower than he had been in a decade, and visibly declining. Lou Gehrig was hitting more consistently. Jimmie Foxx was hitting more home runs. The press was already writing the first draft of Ruth's obituary as an active player. The king was old. The throne was up for grabs. Ruth responded by hitting .341 with 41 home runs and 137 runs batted in. He led the Yankees to 107 wins and a 13-game margin over the rest of the American League. He swept the Chicago Cubs in the World Series, and in the fifth inning of Game 3 at Wrigley Field, with the crowd throwing lemons at him and the Cubs bench calling him every name they could think of, he did something that nobody has been able to fully explain in the 90 years since. He pointed, and then he hit the ball exactly where he pointed. This is the story of the 1932 New York Yankees and the season that proved Babe Ruth was not finished. The season that produced the most famous home run in baseball history. And the last time the greatest player who ever lived reminded the entire sport that he was still the greatest player who ever lived. To understand what Ruth did in 1932, you have to understand what the world expected him to do, which was nothing, which was retire, which was step aside and let the younger generation take over. Ruth had turned 37 in February of that year. In the dead ball era, 37 would have been ancient. In the live ball era that Ruth himself had created, 37 was old enough that the smart money said the decline was irreversible. He had hit 46 home runs in 1931, which was still extraordinary by any standard except the standard Ruth had set for himself. He had hit 49 in 30, 54 in 28, and 60 in 27. The trajectory was clear. The numbers were going down. The body was going up. Ruth weighed well over 230 pounds by 32, his famous belly straining against his pinstripes, his legs heavier, his breathing labored after sprints to first base that used to be effortless. The press treated his decline as inevitable and possibly welcome. Sports writers who had covered Ruth for a decade were ready for a new story. Lou Gehrig, batting behind Ruth in the lineup, had been quietly producing Hall of Fame numbers for years while living in Ruth's shadow. In 1931, Gehrig had tied Ruth with 46 home runs and driven in 184 runs, the American League record. He was 30 years old, 7 years younger than Ruth, and he was clearly the better player on a day-to-day basis. The transition of power from Ruth to Gehrig was not a question of if, it was a question of when. Jimmie Foxx, the Philadelphia Athletics' muscular first baseman, was 24 years old and entering the most destructive phase of his career. He would hit 58 home runs in 1932, the closest anyone had come to Ruth's record of 60 since Ruth himself had set it 5 years earlier. Foxx was younger, stronger, and hungry in the way that young players are hungry, when they can see the throne and believe they can take it. The American League was full of young sluggers who had grown up watching Ruth and who were now swinging for the fences with the same violence that Ruth had pioneered a decade earlier. Hank Greenberg was emerging in Detroit. Al Simmons was in his prime in Philadelphia. The student was becoming the teacher. The revolution Ruth had started was producing an entire generation of players who could match his power without carrying his age, his belly, or his hangovers. Ruth did not care what the press expected. Ruth never cared what the press expected. He showed up to spring training in St. Petersburg, Florida, overweight and undertrained the way he always did. And he started hitting the ball over the fence the way he always did. By opening day, whatever rust had accumulated over the winter had been burned off by the sheer force of his talent and his refusal to accept that he was anything less than the best player alive. The 1932 Yankees were not just a good team. They were one of the greatest teams in the history of baseball, a collection of Hall of Famers and elite role players that would have dominated any era. The lineup was devastating from top to bottom. Earl Combs batted leadoff and played center field. He hit .321 during the regular season with 143 runs scored. He was a Hall of Famer who did his job with quiet efficiency, getting on base and setting the table for the murderers who followed him in the order. Joe Sewell played third base and provided one of the most remarkable statistical achievements in baseball history. He struck out 3 times in 503 at-bats during the 1932 season. 3 times in 503 at-bats. It is one of the lowest strikeout totals for a qualifying hitter in the modern era. Sewell saw the ball, put the bat on the ball, and refused to miss. He was the anti-Ruth in every way except winning. Ruth batted third. Gehrig batted fourth. Together, they formed the most dangerous 3-4 combination in baseball history for the final time. Gehrig hit .349 with 34 home runs and 151 runs batted in. On June 3rd, he hit 4 consecutive home runs against the Philadelphia Athletics at Shibe Park, becoming the first player in the modern era to accomplish the feat. In any other year, on any other team, Gehrig would have been the biggest story in baseball. On this team, he was the second biggest story. Tony Lazzeri played second base and hit .300 with 15 home runs and 113 runs batted in. He was a Hall of Famer who provided power from the middle infield at a time when second basemen were expected to bunt and play defense. Bill Dickey caught and hit .310 with 15 home runs. He was the best catcher in the American League and another future Hall of Famer. Ben Chapman played the outfield and led the American League with 38 stolen bases while driving in 107 runs. The pitching staff was equally loaded. Lefty Gomez, the lanky left-hander from California, went 24-7 and led the staff in wins. Red Ruffing, the power right-hander who had been acquired from the Red Sox 2 years earlier, went 18-7 with a 3.09 ERA. Johnny Allen went 17-4. George Pipgrass won 16 games. Herb Pennock, the veteran left-hander nearing the end of his career, contributed 9 wins. 4 future Hall of Famers were in the everyday lineup. 2 more were on the pitching staff. The 1932 Yankees were loaded with talent in a way that few teams in any sport have ever been. They won 107 games and lost 47, a winning percentage of .695 that ranked among the highest in franchise history. They finished 13 games ahead of the second-place Philadelphia Athletics, Connie Mack's team that had won 3 consecutive American League pennants from 1929 through 31, and that had seemed poised to dominate the decade. The Athletics dynasty was over, dismantled by the Great Depression economics that forced Mack to sell his best players. The Yankees dynasty was back, rebuilt by general manager Ed Barrow and fueled by a lineup so deep that opposing managers ran out of pitching options by the 5th inning. And at the center of it all, at age 37, heavier than he had ever been, supposedly past his prime, carrying a body that sportswriters described in terms usually reserved for circus animals, was Babe Ruth. His numbers during the regular season were staggering by any standard except his own impossible one. He hit .341, a batting average that would have led the American League in most seasons, but that in 1932 finished second to a teammate. He hit 41 home runs, his 7th consecutive season with 40 or more. A streak of sustained, season-after-season power hitting that has never been matched by any player in any era. 7 straight years of 40 home runs. Not even Barry Bonds did that. Not even Hank Aaron, not even Mark McGwire during the steroid era. Only Ruth. He drove in 137 runs. He walked 130 times because pitchers were still terrified to throw him strikes. Even at 37, even with the belly and the heavy legs and the gray creeping into his temples and the sportswriters filing stories about his imminent decline. His on-base percentage was .489, meaning he reached base in nearly half of his plate appearances. His slugging percentage was .661. His OPS was 1.15, a number that placed him among the best offensive seasons of the entire decade. These were not the numbers of a declining player. These were the numbers of one of the 3 or 4 best hitters in baseball at any age, in any era. The obituary writers had been premature. The king was not dead. The king was hitting 41 home runs and batting .341 and walking 130 times because nobody in the American League had figured out how to get him out, even after 13 years of trying. The National League champions were the Chicago Cubs, who had won the pennant with 90 wins under manager Charlie Grimm. The Cubs had a solid lineup built around outfielders Riggs Stevenson, who hit .324, and Kiki Kyler, who hit .291 with 10 home runs. Shortstop Billy Jurgis hit .253. First baseman Charlie Grimm, who also managed the team, hit .270. The rotation was led by Lon Warneka, who went 22-6 with a 2.37 ERA, Guy Bush, who won 19 games, and Charlie Root, a veteran right-hander who would become famous for reasons he never wanted. But the story of the 1932 World Series was not about the Cubs roster. It was about the war that erupted between the two teams before the first pitch was ever thrown. The spark was Mark Koenig. Koenig had been a Yankees shortstop during the great championship teams of 1927 and 28, a key contributor to two of the most dominant teams in baseball history. He had been traded away, bounced around the league, and landed with the Cubs midway through the 1932 season. He hit .353 in 33 games down the stretch and was instrumental in helping the Cubs clinch the pennant. When the Cubs voted on how to divide their World Series bonus money, they gave Koenig a half share, not a full share, a half share. Roughly $4,400 instead of $8,800. The reasoning was that Koenig had only been with the team for half the season. The reasoning was also, in the eyes of the Yankees, despicable. Ruth led the charge. He called the Cubs cheapskates. He called them tightwads. He stood on the top step of the Yankees dugout during batting practice before Game 1 at Yankee Stadium and screamed across the diamond at the Chicago players, questioning their character, their manhood, and their right to call themselves professional athletes. The insults were personal, profane, and relentless. Ruth did not do anything at half volume, including verbal abuse. The Cubs responded with their own insults, aimed at Ruth's age, his weight, his drinking, and his wife Claire, who was sitting in the stands. The animosity was genuine. Both teams hated each other. Both teams wanted to win, not just for the championship, but for the satisfaction of destroying the other. Joe McCarthy, the Yankees manager, had his own separate grudge that added another layer of venom to an already toxic series. McCarthy had managed the Chicago Cubs in 1929 and led them to the National League pennant, winning 98 games and taking the franchise to the World Series for the first time in 11 years. Despite this success, the Cubs fired him after the 1930 season, citing philosophical differences with the front office. McCarthy viewed the dismissal as a betrayal. He had given the Cubs the best years of his managerial career and been thrown away like a used ticket stub. He landed with the Yankees in 1931 and immediately began building the team that would dominate the American League for the next decade. Now, in 1932, he was managing against the franchise that had discarded him. The World Series was not just a championship for McCarthy. It was retribution. He wanted to beat the Cubs. He wanted to embarrass them. He wanted to make them regret every day since the morning they told him he was not good enough for their organization. And he had assembled a roster capable of doing exactly that. Game 1 at Yankee Stadium set the tone. The Yankees scored 12 runs. The Cubs scored 6. It was not as close as the score suggested. The Yankees built a massive early lead and coasted. Gehrig homered. The entire lineup contributed. The Cubs looked overwhelmed from the first inning. Game 2 was tighter but still decisive. Lefty Gomez pitched a complete game, and the Yankees won 5-2. The series moved to Chicago, with the Yankees leading 2-0. The Cubs needed to win at Wrigley Field or face elimination. The Chicago fans were waiting for them. They had read every word of the insults Ruth had thrown at their team in the New York papers. They had read about the cheapskate accusations. They had spent 2 days watching their team lose at Yankee Stadium on newsreel footage at movie theaters across the city. And they had been stewing in humiliation and rage. When the Yankees arrived at Wrigley Field for Game 3 on October 1, 1932, the atmosphere was unlike anything the World Series had ever produced. Ruth and Claire were pelted with lemons and pieces of fruit as they made their way from the team bus to the visitors' dugout. The crowd screamed obscenities that were audible from blocks away. Women in the stands shouted things at Claire Ruth that would have started fights in any other setting. The Cubs bench, led by pitcher Guy Bush, who had been designated as the team's primary verbal antagonist, hurled insults at Ruth from the moment he set foot on the Wrigley Field grass. They called him fat. They called him old. They called him a broken-down has-been who should be in a rocking chair instead of a batter's box. They called Claire names that no newspaper in America would print. Ruth absorbed every word. He did not retreat to the clubhouse. He did not complain to the umpires or demand that the abuse stop. He smiled. He waved. He tipped his cap to the fans who booed him the loudest, the same mocking, theatrical tip he had been using for 2 decades to acknowledge hostility and transform it into fuel. The louder they screamed, the wider he grinned. Babe Ruth had never run from a fight in his life. He was certainly not going to start at 37 in October with the whole country watching. In the first inning, with runners on base, Ruth stepped to the plate against Charlie Root, a 33-year-old right-hander who had won 15 games during the regular season. Root was a tough, combative pitcher who had earned his spot in the rotation through 13 years of professional durability. He was pitching in front of his home crowd in the biggest game of his career. He stared at Ruth with the confidence of a man who believed he belonged on the same mound as the greatest hitter alive. Ruth took a pitch, took another, then he uncoiled that massive swing, the swing that had changed baseball, and launched a 3-run home run deep into the right field bleachers. The ball traveled well over 400 feet. Wrigley Field, which had been a cauldron of noise and fury, fell momentarily, shockingly silent. Ruth rounded the bases with a grin that stretched from ear to ear, visible from the last row of the upper deck, and he gestured at the Cubs' dugout as he touched home plate. He was not just hitting. He was performing. He was reminding 50,000 hostile witnesses that he was Babe Ruth, and they were not. The Cubs fought back. They tied the game at 4 in the bottom of the 4th. The crowd came alive again. The insults resumed. Guy Bush screamed from the dugout. Lemons rolled across the outfield grass. The atmosphere was hostile in a way that modern baseball rarely produces, a World Series game that felt more like a street fight. In the top of the 5th inning, with the score tied 4-4 and the crowd at full fury, Babe Ruth stepped to the plate for the at-bat that would become the most famous in baseball history. The Cubs bench was on its feet. Guy Bush, who had not pitched that day but had appointed himself the team's chief tormentor, was standing on the top step of the dugout screaming at Ruth with a fury that could be heard in the upper deck. Other Cubs players joined in. The words were vicious, personal, and aimed at everything Ruth held dear: his age, his body, his talent, and his wife sitting in the stands above. Lemons and wadded paper continued to rain from the bleachers. The umpires did nothing. In 1932, this was simply how baseball was played. Ruth stepped in against Root. He dug his back foot into the dirt. He gripped the bat near the knob the way he always did, his enormous hands wrapped around the handle with a looseness that disguised the violence of his swing. He looked at Root. He looked at the Cubs' dugout. He was smiling. That was the part that unnerved people. In the middle of the most hostile environment in baseball, surrounded by 50,000 people who wanted him to fail, Babe Ruth was smiling. Charlie Root delivered the first pitch. Strike 1. Ruth did not swing. He held up one finger toward the Cubs' dugout, as if to say, "That is one." The crowd roared. The Cubs' bench screamed louder. Root delivered again. Ball 1, then ball 2. The count moved to 2-1. Root came back with a strike. Strike 2. Ruth held up 2 fingers. Or he pointed, or he gestured toward center field, or he waved his hand in the general direction of the outfield. What exactly he did with his hand in that fraction of a second has been debated for 9 decades, analyzed through grainy newsreel footage frame by frame, argued about in books and documentaries and doctoral dissertations and barroom conversations in every city in America. Some witnesses said he pointed at the center field bleachers, calling his shot the way a billiards player calls a pocket. Others said he pointed at the Cubs' dugout, directing his anger at Guy Bush and the bench jockeys who had been riding him all afternoon. Others said he was simply acknowledging the count, holding up fingers to show how many strikes he had taken. Root delivered the next pitch. Ruth swung. The ball exploded off his bat and rocketed toward the deepest part of Wrigley Field, climbing higher and higher into the October sky, a towering arc that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should allow, clearing the center field fence by a comfortable margin and landing an estimated 440 feet from home plate. Home run. Wrigley Field went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that only happens when 50,000 people simultaneously lose the ability to speak. Then it erupted, not with cheers but with the stunned, involuntary gasp of a crowd that had just witnessed something it could not fully process. Ruth rounded the bases laughing, his body jiggling with each stride, his face split open in a grin so wide it looked like it might break. He gestured at the Cubs' dugout as he passed third base, pointing at Guy Bush, at the bench jockeys, at everyone who had spent 3 games telling him he was finished. He touched home plate and pointed at the Chicago bench one final time, as if to deliver a closing argument that required no words. Lou Gehrig, who had been standing in the on-deck circle watching the entire spectacle unfold, stepped to the plate and hit the very next pitch from a shell-shocked Charlie Root for another home run. Back-to-back, the 2 greatest teammates in baseball history, hitting consecutive home runs off the same devastated pitcher in the same inning of the same World Series game, as if the moment needed an exclamation point and Gehrig was there to provide it. The Yankees led 5-4. The Cubs never recovered. They won Game 3 7-5. Whether Ruth actually called his shot remains the most debated question in baseball history. Film footage from multiple angles confirms that he made a pointing gesture with his right hand before the final pitch. What the footage cannot confirm is what he was pointing at. The center field bleachers, the Cubs' dugout, the sky, Charlie Root himself. Root denied the called shot until the day he died. He told reporters that if Ruth had pointed at the fence, he would have put the next pitch in his ear. Ruth himself told different stories at different times. In some interviews, he claimed he pointed at center field and predicted the home run. In others, he said he was pointing at the Cubs' bench, telling them they had only 1 strike left to get him. The sports writer Joe Williams used the billiards term "called his shot" in his column the next day, and the phrase entered the American language permanently. The truth is that nobody knows. Nobody will ever know. The gesture happened in a fraction of a second in front of 50,000 screaming fans, and every witness saw something slightly different. What everyone agrees on is this: Babe Ruth, at 37 years old, overweight, past his supposed prime, stood at the plate in the most hostile environment in baseball and hit a home run to the deepest part of the ballpark, after making a gesture that suggested he knew exactly what he was about to do. Whether he called it or not, the result was the same. The ball went over the fence. The Cubs went silent, and Babe Ruth became, for one more October afternoon, the most dangerous man in baseball. Game 4 closed the series the next day at Wrigley Field, and any hope the Cubs might have had of extending the series evaporated within the first 3 innings. The Cubs took an early 4-1 lead behind a 3-run homer from Frank Demery in the first inning, and for a brief, tantalizing moment, the Chicago crowd dared to believe that their team might force a Game 5. The belief lasted approximately 2 innings. The Yankees began chipping away in the third, tying the game with a patient, methodical rally that demonstrated the difference between the 2 teams. The Cubs swung wildly and hoped for the best. The Yankees worked counts, drew walks, found holes, and scored runs in bunches. Tony Lazzeri, the quiet Italian second baseman from San Francisco, who had been overshadowed by Ruth and Gehrig for his entire career, stepped into the spotlight and delivered the performance of his life. He hit 2 two-run homers during the Yankees' rally, each one landing deeper than the last, each one draining a little more life from a Cubs team that had been beaten emotionally before it was beaten on the scoreboard. The game was tied 5-5 for 6 innings. Then the Yankees pulled away. They scored 2 in the 7th, 2 more in the 8th, 4 in the 9th. The final score was 13-6, a game that had been competitive for most of the afternoon before collapsing into a rout in the final frames. The sweep was complete. 4 games, 4 victories. 37 runs scored by the Yankees to 19 by the Cubs. A combined margin of 18 runs across the series. It was the Yankees' 3rd World Series sweep in 6 years, following the 4-game demolitions of the Pirates in 1927 and the Cardinals in 1928. Total, systematic, unapologetic domination. Ruth finished the series batting .333 with 2 home runs and 6 runs batted in. Gehrig was statistically superior, hitting .529 with 3 home runs and 8 RBI. the most dominant individual performance in the series by a wide margin. But history would remember Gehrig's numbers as a footnote and Ruth's called shot as the headline. Gehrig was the better player in the 1932 World Series. Ruth was the better story, and in baseball the story wins every time. It always has. It always will. The 1932 World Series was Ruth's 10th and final full classic. He had appeared in his first in 1915 as a 20-year-old left-handed pitcher for the Boston Red Sox, throwing 14 scoreless innings against the Brooklyn Robins. He had appeared in his last in 1932 as a 37-year-old outfielder for the New York Yankees, pointing at center field and hitting a home run that became the most debated moment in baseball history. 17 years between his first and his last. 7 championships, 10 World Series. A career in October that spanned nearly 2 decades and that no player before or since has matched in length, drama, or cultural impact. After 1932, the decline that the press had been predicting for 3 years finally arrived. And this time, it was real and irreversible. In 1933, Ruth hit .301 with 34 home runs and 103 runs batted in. The numbers were still impressive by any standard except the standard he had established over the previous 13 years. But the batting average had dropped 40 points. The home run total had dropped 7. The RBI total had dropped 34. The trajectory was unmistakable. The greatest hitter in baseball was losing his battle against time. In 1934, Ruth hit .288 with 22 home runs and 84 RBI. It was the first time since 1925 that he had failed to hit 30 home runs in a full season. His legs were heavy, his swing was a half beat slower. He could still hit the ball extraordinary distances when he connected, but he connected less often, and the pitchers who had feared him for 13 years began to sense that the fear was no longer necessary. Ruth wanted to manage the Yankees after his playing career ended. The Yankees did not want him. He left New York after the '34 season and signed with the Boston Braves, ostensibly as a player assistant manager, with the promise of eventually taking over the full managerial role. The promise was empty. The Braves wanted Ruth's name on the marquee to sell tickets. They had no intention of letting him manage. Ruth played 28 games for the Braves in 1935 and hit .181 with 6 home runs. He was 40 years old. His body could no longer do what his mind still believed it could. His final memorable game came on May 25th at Forbes Field in Pittsburgh, where he hit 3 home runs in a single afternoon. The last of the 3, his 714th career home run, cleared the right field grandstand entirely and became the first ball ever hit completely out of Forbes Field. It was a parting shot from a man who had spent 20 years hitting balls that nobody else could reach. He retired 6 days later. But the decline makes 1932 more remarkable, not less. Because it means the called shot season was not the middle of Ruth's career. It was the end. The last great chapter. The final opportunity to remind the world that the fat kid from the reform school in Baltimore was still the most important figure in the history of American sports. And he did not waste it. He could have coasted through 32. He could have hit 300 with 30 home runs and let Gehrig carry the team. He could have played it safe, protected his body, and eased into retirement the way most aging stars do, their numbers declining gradually, their impact fading quietly, their legend settling into memory without a final exclamation point. Instead, he hit 41 home runs. He batted .341. He drove in 137 runs. He swept the Cubs in 4 games. And he stood at the plate at Wrigley Field with lemons at his feet and insults in his ears and pointed at something, at the bleachers or the dugout or the sky or the future, and hit the ball exactly where he pointed. 41 home runs at 37, a .341 average at 37, 137 RBI at 37, a World Series sweep at 37, and the called shot, whatever it actually was, at 37. Every player in the American League was younger than him. Every player in the American League was supposed to be better than him. And every player in the American League watched him hit a ball 440 feet at Wrigley Field, while 50,000 people threw lemons at his wife. The 1932 season was Ruth's final argument, his closing statement to the jury of history. He stood at the plate and said, "I am still here. I am still the best. And if you doubt me, watch this." Then he swung, and the ball disappeared into the Chicago sky. And nobody doubted him again. 37 years old, 230 pounds, lemons on the ground, insults in the air, and the greatest home run in baseball history sailing over the center field fence at Wrigley Field, while the most famous athlete on earth rounded the bases laughing. That is how a 37-year-old Babe Ruth humbled the entire MLB, not by being young, not by being fast, not by being in the best shape of his life, by being Babe Ruth, by refusing to accept that anyone, at any age, in any stadium, throwing any pitch, could stop him from doing what he was born to do. He pointed, he swung, he won, and the argument was over. Like and subscribe for more baseball documentaries. Until next time.